I am now standing in the shadow of the Houses of Parliament in the part of London called Westminster. It is the year of grace 1850. Around me lies Victorian London, the London of Dickens and Thackeray, of John Stuart Mill and Thomas Carlyle. This capital city is now the center of the greatest colonial empire the world has ever known, shortly to embrace between 1/5 and 1/4 of the total population and land area of the entire earth. Although in theory there are still empires ruled by the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Belgians, and the Danes, all of these, in this year of 1850, are but satellites of the British Empire. Britain is the mistress of the seas, the empire upon which the sun never sets. It is the new Rome on the banks of the Thames. The empress is Victoria, who is largely occupied with Prince Albert in her business of breeding new litters of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to take over the royal houses of Europe. A quarter of a century from now, Victoria will be made Empress of India to reward her for so much breeding. But for all of Victoria's wealth and power, Britain is not really a monarchy. It is an oligarchy on the Venetian model, and the most powerful leader of the British oligarchy in these times, between 1830 and the end of the American Civil War, is Lord Palmerston. Henry Temple, the third Viscount Palmerston. Palmerston is the man the others, the Disraelis, Russells, and Gladstone, simply cannot match. Palmerston was first a Tory, then a Whig, but always a disciple of Jeremy Bentham. And for 35 years there is scarcely a cabinet without Palmerston as Foreign Secretary or Prime Minister. In London they call him Lord Cupid, always on the lookout for a new mistress, a Regency buck, perfectly at home in a ménage à trois. On the continent they call him Lord Firebrand. The schoolboys of Vienna sing a song that if the devil has a son, that son is Lord Palmerston. Pam. Pam is an occultist who loves Satanism and seances. And here between Big Ben and the Foreign Office are the haunts of this 19th century devil, Lord Palmerston, Old Pam. It is 1850. Lord Palmerston is engaged in a campaign to make London the undisputed center of a new worldwide Roman Empire. He is attempting to conquer the world in the way that the British have already conquered India, reducing every other nation to the role of a puppet, client, and fall guy for British imperial policy. Lord Palmerston's campaign is not a secret. He has declared it here in the Houses of Parliament, saying that wherever in the world a British subject goes, he can flaunt the laws, secure that the British fleet will support him. Civis Romanus sum. Every Briton is a citizen of the new Rome, thundered Lord Palmerston. And with that, the universal empire was proclaimed. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British managed to conquer most of the world outside of Europe, with the exception of the United States. After 1850, the French, be they restored Bourbon, Orleanists, or Bonapartists, are generally pliant tools of London. But in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a Prince Metternich and his Austrian Empire, a very strong land power. There was vast imperial Russia under the autocrat Nicholas or the reformer Alexander II. There was the Kingdom of Prussia. Lord Palmerston likes to call these the arbitrary powers. Above all, Palmerston hated Metternich, the embodiment and ideologue of the Congress of Vienna system. Metternich presided over one of the most pervasive police states in history. Men said that his rule was shored up by a standing army of soldiers, a sitting army of bureaucrats, a kneeling army of priests, and a creeping army of informers. For Britain to rule the world, the Holy Alliance of Austria, Russia, and Prussia had to be broken up. There is also the matter of the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. Starting with Lord Byron's Greek Revolution in the 1820s, British policy has been to play the card of national liberation against each of these rival empires. The imperial theme was sounded in 1846 with the free trade policy. Britain's declaration of intent to loot the world in the name of the pound. Then, in January 1848, Lord Palmerston arranged an insurrection in Sicily, using British networks that date back to Lord Nelson. That started the great revolutionary year of 1848. And in the course of that year, every government in Europe was toppled, every monarchy badly shaken, at least for a time. Metternich of Austria and King Louis-Philippe of France fled to London, where they now spend their time playing cards. There was war in Italy, civil war in Austria, barricades in Paris, and tumult in Germany. The only exception to this rule was Russia. And now Lord Palmerston is preparing to invade Russia with the help of his strategic catamite, Napoleon III, also known as Napoleon le Petit. That will start in about 3 years, and it will be called the Crimean War. As soon as the war against Russia is over, Palmerston and John Stuart Mill of the British East India Company will start the Great Mutiny in India, which some historians will call the Sepoy Rebellion. Muslim soldiers will be told that the new cartridges issued them are greased with pig fat. Hindu soldiers will be told that they're greased with cow fat, and the result will be what you would expect. But in this conflagration, the British will get rid of the Great Mogul and the Mughal Empire and impose their direct rule on all of India. That's typical John Stuart Mill. He, of course, is the author of On Liberty. The British would like to give China the same treatment they are giving India. Since 1842, Palmerston and the East India Company have been waging war against the Chinese Empire, partly to get them to open their ports to opium to India, and also as a way to conquer China. Already the British have Hong Kong and the other treaty ports. By 1860, the British will be in Beijing, looting and burning the summer palace of the emperor. Shortly after that, the British will back Napoleon in his project of putting a Habsburg archduke on the throne of an ephemeral Mexican empire, the Maximilian Project. These projects will be closely coordinated with Palmerston's plans to eliminate the only two nations still able to oppose him, the Russia of Alexander II and the United States of Abraham Lincoln. Lord Palmerston will be the evil demiurge of the American Civil War, the mastermind of secession, far more important for the Confederacy than Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee. And in the midst of that war, Palmerston will detonate a rebellion in Poland against Russian rule, not for the sake of Poland, but for the sake of starting a general European war against Russia. But when the Russian fleets sail into New York and San Francisco, when Lee's wave breaks at Gettysburg, and when the stars and bars are lowered over Vicksburg, the British Empire will be stopped just short of its goal. Just short. And yet, British hegemony will still be great enough to launch the two world wars of the 20th century and the third conflagration that will begin in 1991. And as we look forward, for a century and a half from 1850, British geopolitics, despite the challenges, despite the defeats, despite the putrefaction of Britain itself, will remain the dominant factor in world affairs. How do they do it? How do the British do it? How can a clique of depraved aristocrats on this tight little island bid to rule the entire world? Don't believe the stories about the workshop of the world. There are some factories here, but Britain lives by looting the colonies. The fleet is formidable, but overrated and very vulnerable to serious challenges. The army, third rate. But the British have learned from the Venetians that the greatest force in history is the force of ideas, and that if you can control culture, you can control the way people think, then statesmen and fleets and armies will bend to your will. Take our friend Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston has the Foreign Office, the Home Office, Whitehall. But when he needed to start the 1848 revolutions, or when the time will come to start the American Civil War, he turns to a troika of agents. These are Lord Palmerston's These are Lord Palmerston's three stooges. But instead of Moe, Larry, and Curly, these three stooges are named Giuseppe Mazzini, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and David Urquhart. These three stooges, far more than the Union Jack, Victoria, the Bulldog breed, the thin gray line of heroes, and the fleet, are the heart of what is called the British Empire. Now, we will get to know Lord Palmerston's three stooges better. But first, one thing must be understood. Moe, Larry, and Curly often worked together on this or that project, but their relations were never exactly placid. I think that will suffice to... I think you will understand their stock in trade was indeed infantile violence. So do not be surprised if we find Lord Palmerston's three stooges lashing out with slanders, knives, and bombs against each other, and even against their august master, Lord Palmerston himself.
20 minutes to a pound.
Under Lord Palmerston, England supports all revolutions except her own. And the leading revolutionary on Her Majesty's Secret Service is Giuseppe Mazzini, our first stooge. Now, Mazzini has concocted a very effective terrorist belief structure. Mazzini is a Genoese admirer of the diabolical Venetian friar Paolo Sarpi. Mazzini's father was a physician to Queen Victoria's father. And for a while, Mazzini worked for the Carbonari, one of Napoleon's Freemasonic fronts.
What about those suitcases I put in that ice cream truck?
Then, in 1831, Mazzini founded his Young Italy Secret Society. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, today's president of France, sent him articles for his magazine. Mazzini's cry is, God and the people, Dio e popolo, which means in practice that the people are the new God. Populism becomes a kind of ersatz religion. Mazzini teaches that Christianity developed the human individual, but that the era of Christianity, freedom, human rights is now over. From now on, the protagonists of history are not individuals anymore, but peoples, understood as racial nationalities. Mazzini is adamant that there are no inalienable human rights. There is only duty, the duty of thought and action to serve the destiny of the racial collectivities. Liberty, says Mazzini, is not the negation of all authority. It is the negation of every authority that fails to represent the collective aim of the nation. There is no individual human soul, only a collective soul. According to Mazzini, the Catholic Church, the papacy, and every other institution which attempts to bring God to man must be abolished. Every national grouping that can be identified must be given independence and self-determination in a centralized dictatorship. In the coming century, Mussolini and the Italian fascists will repeat many of Mazzini's ideas verbatim. Mazzini thinks that each modern nation has a mission. The British would take care of industry and colonies, the Poles, leadership of the Slavic world, the Russians, the civilization of Asia, the French get action, the Germans take care of thought, and so forth. For some strange reason, there is no mission for Ireland, and therefore Mazzini does not support the independence of Ireland. There is, in fact, only one monarchy which Mazzini supports, because he says it has deep roots among the people. You guessed it, Queen Victoria. Mazzini preaches an Italian revolution for the Third Rome. After the Rome of the Caesars and the Rome of the popes comes the Rome of the people. For this, the pope must be driven out. Mazzini has tried to put this into practice just last year. In November 1848, armed Young Italy gangs forced Pope Pius IX to flee from Rome to Naples. From March to June of 1849, Mazzini ruled Rome and the Papal States as one of three dictators, all of them Grand Orient Freemasons. During that time, death squads operated in Rome, Ancona, and other cities. Some churches were sacked and many confessionals were burned. For Easter 1849, Mazzini staged a monstrous mock Eucharist in the Vatican he called the Novum Pascha, featuring himself, God, and the people. During that time, Mazzini was planning to set up his own Italian national church on the Anglican model. The defense of Rome was organized by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who had joined Mazzini's Young Italy in the early 1830s. But a French army sent by fellow stooge Louis Napoleon drove out Mazzini, Garibaldi, and their supporters. Lord Palmerston said that Mazzini's dictatorship in Rome was by far better than any regime the Romans have had for centuries. Right now, Mazzini is here in London, enjoying the support of Lord Ashley, the Earl of Shaftesbury, a Protestant fanatic who also happens to be Lord Palmerston's son-in-law. Mazzini's direct access to the British government payroll comes through James Stansfeld, a junior Lord of the Admiralty and very high official of British intelligence. Last year, Stansfeld provided money for Mazzini's Roman Republic. John Bowring of the Foreign Office is another of Mazzini's patrons. He's the man who will start the second Opium War against China. Bowring is also Jeremy Bentham's literary executor. John Stuart Mill of India House is another of Mazzini's friends. Mazzini is close to the proto-fascist writer Thomas Carlyle and has been having an affair with Carlyle's wife. Now, one of Metternich's henchmen once said that the Palmerston policy is to make Italy turbulent, which is bad for Austria, without making her powerful, which would be a threat to England. Mazzini's role in Italy has been that of a marplot, a saboteur, a wrecker, a terrorist, an assassin. His specialty is to send his brainwashed dupes to their deaths in terrorist attacks. He hides out and always succeeds in saving himself. Mazzini travels readily on the continent using false passports, posing as American, an Englishman, or even a rabbi. In the 30s and 40s, Mazzini was targeting Piedmont in the north and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in southern Italy. In 1848, he rushed to Milan as soon as the Austrians had been driven out and tried to start trouble. One of Mazzini's agents was General Ramorino, and he let the Austrian commander Radetzky outflank the Piedmontese and win the Battle of Novara. Mazzini's man Ramorino was executed for treason, but Piedmont had lost the First War of Italian Liberation. The king abdicated, and Mazzini tried to break up Piedmont with a revolt in Genoa. 3 years from now, Mazzini will stage an abortive revolt against the Austrians in Milan, mainly to stop Austria from allying with Russia in the Crimean War. A few years after that, Mazzini will try another insurrection in Genova, still trying to break up Piedmont. In 1860, Mazzini will encourage Garibaldi to sail to Sicily and then try to provoke a civil war between Garibaldi's dictatorship in southern Italy and Cavour's Piedmontese government in the north. In 1860, Mazzini will be thrown out of Naples as a provocateur. By that time, Mazzini will be a hated and reviled figure, but British propaganda and British support will keep him going. Mazzini is also an assassination bureau. In 1848, there was a chance that Pius IX's very capable reforming minister, Pellegrino Rossi, could unify Italy and solve the Roman question in a constructive way through an Italian confederation chaired by the Pope, arranged with the help of Gioberti, Cavour, and other Piedmontese. Mazzini's agents, members of Young Italy, stabbed Pellegrino Rossi to death. The killer was in touch with Lord Minto, Lord Palmerston's special envoy for Italy. Stooge violence between Mazzini and Napoleon III is always very intense, especially after Napoleon's army finished off Mazzini's Roman Republic. In 1855, a Mazzini agent named Giovanni Pianori will attempt to kill Napoleon III, and a French court will convict Mazzini. Have Napoleon's forces outshone the bungling British in the Crimea? Are the British nervous about Napoleon's new ironclad battleship when they have none? Attempts to kill Napoleon are run by the Tibaldi Fund, run by Mazzini and set up by Sir James Stansfield of the Admiralty. Later, in February 1858, there will be an attempt to blow up Napoleon by one of Mazzini's closest and best-known lieutenants from the Roman Republic, Felice Orsini. Napoleon will get the message that it is time to get busy and start a war against Austria in 1859. At other times, Mazzini tried to kill King Carlo Alberto of Piedmont. Mazzini's Young Italy is always the party of the dagger, of the stiletto. In the hands of Judith, the sword which cut short the life of Holofernes was holy. Holy was the dagger which Harmodius crowned with roses. Holy was the dagger of Brutus. Holy the poniard of the Sicilian who began the Vespers. Holy was the arrow of Tell. Vintage Mazzini. London's future ability to assassinate men like Walter Rathenau, Jürgen Ponto, Aldo Moro, Herrhausen, Rohwedder, and others stretches back in unbroken continuity to the Mazzini networks of today. Mazzini is actually doing everything he can to prevent Italian unity. When unity comes 20 years from now, it will come in the form of a highly centralized state dominated by Grand Orient Freemasons. For 30 years, the prime ministers will be Mazzini's agents, like De Pretis and Crispi. Because of the violent liquidation of the papal states, the Catholics will refuse to take part in politics. Italy will remain weak, poor, and divided. After Mussolini, the Italian Republican Party will identify itself with Mazzini, and Ugo La Malfa and his friends will continue Mazzini's efforts to make sure that Italy is weak and divided, bringing down one government after the other and ruining the economy. But Mazzini's work for the British extends far beyond Italy. Like the Foreign Office and the Admiralty which he serves, Mazzini encompasses the world. The Mazzini networks offer us a fantastic array of movements and personalities. There are agents, dupes, professional killers, fellow travelers, criminal energy types. Mazzini's Court of Miracles was a public scandal. King Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the King of Belgium, has been complaining to his niece, Queen Victoria, that in London there is maintained a sort of menagerie of Kossuths, Mazzinis, Lagrange, Ledru, Rollin, etc., to let loose occasionally on the continent to render its quiet and prosperity impossible. Indeed, on February 21st, 1854, this crew will come together in the home of the American consul, George Sanders. Mazzini, Felice Orsini, Garibaldi, Kossuth, Arnold Ruger, Ledru Rollin, Stanley Wartzel, Alexander Herzen, and the U.S. trader and future president, James Buchanan. There'll also be a Peabody from the counting house. We can think of Mazzini as the zookeeper of a kind of universal human zoo. Now, Mazzini's human zoo is divided into theme parks, or pavilions, one for each ethnic group. In a normal zoo, there's an elephant house, a monkey house, an alligator pond, and so forth. In Mazzini's zoo, there's an Italian house, a Russian house, a Hungarian house, a Polish house, and an American house. Let's walk through the various theme parks in the zoo and identify some of the specimens. Young Italy, as we've seen, was founded in 1831, attracting the young sailor Giuseppe Garibaldi and Louis Napoleon. Shortly thereafter, there followed Young Poland, whose leaders included the revolutionaries Lelevel and Wurzel. Then came Young Germany, featuring Arnold Ruger, who had published some material by an obscure German Red Republican named Karl Marx. This is the Young Germany satirized by Heinrich Heine. In 1834, Mazzini founded Young Europe. Young Europe was billed as the Holy Alliance of the People, opposed to Metternich's Holy Alliance of Despots. By 1835, there was also a Young Switzerland. And in that same year, Mazzini launched Young France. The guiding light here was Ledru Rollin, who later became Interior Minister in 1848. There was also Young Corsica, and that was the Mafia. By the end of this century, we will have a Young Argentina founded by Garibaldi, Young Bosnia, Young India, Young Russia, Young Armenia, Young Egypt, the Young Czechs, plus similar movements in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece. Mazzini is especially interested in creating a South Slavic federation dominated by Belgrade. And for that reason, he has a Serbian organization. That will have to wait for Mazzini's student Woodrow Wilson and the Versailles Peace Conference of 1919. Right now, a Masonic group in the United States is gearing up to support the pro-slavery dough-faced Democrat Franklin Pierce for president in 1852. They call themselves Young America. In the future, there will also be the Young Turks. And yes, there is also a Palmerston-Mazzini front for the Jews, sometimes called Young Israel and sometimes called the Nye Brit. For Mazzini, a nationality means a race, a fixed array of behavior like a breed of dog or a species of animal. He's not thinking of a national community united by a literate language and a classical culture to which any person can become assimilated through a political choice. For Mazzini, race is unchangeable. Race is destiny. It's a matter of blood and soil. Cats fight dogs. French fight Germans. Germans fight Poles, and so on through all eternity. These hatreds are the main datum of century perception. Each of Mazzini's organizations demands immediate national liberation for its own ethnic group on the basis of aggressive chauvinism and expansionism. Mazzini's warhorse is the territorial imperative. They're all obsessed with borders, territory. Each one finds a way to sabotage dirigistic economic development. Each one is eager to submerge and repress the other national groupings in the pursuit of its own mystical destiny. This is Mazzini's racist gospel of universal ethnic cleansing. Now, we've seen some Italian cages. We also have the Hungarian theme park in the zoo. Our principal specimen here is Louis Kossuth, a leader of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848-1849. Kossuth told the British he was for free trade. He wanted equal status for Hungarians in the Austrian Empire, equal with the Austrians. But within the Hungarian part of the Habsburg Empire, there were other groups, Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, Serbs, Romanians, Croatians, and others. Would they receive political and linguistic autonomy? Kossuth's answer was to ban all official use of Slavic and Romanian languages in favor of Hungarian. Kossuth was therefore on a course for bloody collision with the Illyrian movement for Greater Croatia and with the military forces of the Croatian leader Jelačić. There was also conflict with Serbs. Mazzini had promised the same territory to Hungary, to the Croatians, and to his Serbian South Slav entity. And then there was the question of Transylvania, claimed by the Hungarians, but also by the young Romania of Dimitrie Golescu, another Mazzini agent. Young Romania's program was to restore the kingdom of Dacia, as it had existed before the Roman Emperor, called the Nye Brit. For Mazzini, a nationality means a race, a fixed array of behavior like a breed of dog or a species of animal. He's not thinking of a national community united by a literate language and a classical culture to which any person can become assimilated through a political choice. For Mazzini, race is unchangeable. Race is destiny. It's a matter of blood and soil. Cats fight dogs. French fight Germans. Germans fight Poles, and so on through all eternity. These hatreds are the main datum of century perception. Each of Mazzini's organizations demands immediate national liberation for its own ethnic group on the basis of aggressive chauvinism and expansionism. Mazzini's warhorse is the territorial imperative. They're all obsessed with borders, territory. Each one finds a way to sabotage dirigistic economic development. Each one is eager to submerge and repress the other national groupings in the pursuit of its own mystical destiny. This is Mazzini's racist gospel of universal ethnic cleansing. Now, we've seen some Italian cages. We also have the Hungarian theme park in the zoo. Our principal specimen here is Louis Kossuth, a leader of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848-1849. Kossuth told the British he was for free trade. He wanted equal status for Hungarians in the Austrian Empire, equal with the Austrians. But within the Hungarian part of the Habsburg Empire, there were other groups, Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, Serbs, Romanians, Croatians, and others. Would they receive political and linguistic autonomy? Kossuth's answer was to ban all official use of Slavic and Romanian languages in favor of Hungarian. Kossuth was therefore on a course for bloody collision with the Illyrian movement for Greater Croatia and with the military forces of the Croatian leader Jelačić. There was also conflict with Serbs. Mazzini had promised the same territory to Hungary, to the Croatians, and to his Serbian South Slav entity. And then there was the question of Transylvania, claimed by the Hungarians, but also by the young Romania of Dimitrie Golescu, another Mazzini agent. Young Romania's program was to restore the kingdom of Dacia, as it had existed before the Roman Emperor Trajan. So young Hungary and young Romania were pre-programmed to fight to the death over Transylvania, which they did last year. Because of the ceaseless strife of Hungarians, Croatians, Serbians, Romanians, it proved possible for the Habsburgs to save their police state with the help of a Russian army. So we see the ethnic theme houses of the zoo sally forth to fight not just the Habsburgs and the Romanovs, but most of all, each other. And we will find the same thing in viewing the Russian and Polish pavilions. The young Poland of Lelewel and Vorzel demands the recreation of the Polish state and the rollback of the partitions of Poland. But they go much further, claiming borders from the Baltic to the shores of the Black Sea, the Jagiellonian borders. This includes an explicit denial that any Ukrainian nation exists. In the orbit of young Poland is the poet Adam Mickiewicz, a close friend of Mazzini's, who was with him last year during the Roman Republic. Mickiewicz argues that Poland is special because it has suffered more than any other nation. Poland is the Christ among nations. Mickiewicz dreams of uniting all of the West and South Slavs against the tyrant of the North, the barbarians of the North. And by that he means Russia, the main target. Young Poland's program also foreshadows an obvious conflict with young Germany over Silesia. Young Russia means the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin and the aristocratic ideologue Alexander Herzen. Herzen is an agent of Baron James Rothschild of Paris. Right after the Crimean War, Herzen will start publishing the Polar Star and the Bell, leak sheets for British secret intelligence that will build up their readership by divulging state secrets. Now, Herzen's obvious target is Tsar Alexander II, the ally of Lincoln. Herzen prints the ravings of Bakunin, who preaches pan-Slavism, the idea that Russia will take over all the other Slavic nations. Out of an ocean of blood and fire, there will rise in Moscow, high in the sky, the star of the revolution to become the guide of liberated mankind. Vintage Bakunin, vintage Third Rome. If Mazzini relies on the stiletto, for Bakunin, it's the peasant's axe that will bring down the German regime, as he calls it, in St. Petersburg. So Herzen's role is to sabotage Alexander II and his policy of real anti-British reform in Russia, to block capitalist development. He preaches reliance on the aboriginal Slavic village, the mir, communal ownership of land, plus the ancient Slavic workshop, the artel. Now, the mir will never build the Trans-Siberian Railway. Herzen is sometimes called a Westernizer, but he is totally hostile to Western civilization. He writes of the need of a new Attila, perhaps Russian, perhaps American, perhaps both, to tear down the old Europe. In the moment when the British will seem so close to winning everything, Herzen will support Palmerston's Polish insurrection of 1863, and he'll lose most of his readers. Once the American Civil War is over, the British will have little use for Herzen. By then, London will be betting on the nihilist terrorists of the Narodnaya Volnya, who will finally kill Alexander II. And London will use the Russian legal Marxists. But today we can see the conflicts between young Poland and young Russia, the national chauvinist operations that are laying the roots for the slaughter of World War I. Now, let us view the cages in the American theme park in Mazzini's Human Zoo. Young America. This name was popularized in 1845 by Edwin de Leon, the son of a Scottish Rite Jewish slave-trading family of Charleston, South Carolina. Edwin de Leon will later be one of the leaders of the Confederate espionage service in Europe. Young America's leader is George Sanders, the future editor of the Democratic Review. Young America's program of Manifest Destiny is a slave empire in Mexico and the Caribbean. In the 1852 election, Young America will be backing the dark horse Democrat Franklin Pierce against the patriotic Winfield Scott. Scott's Whig Party will be destroyed. Young America operatives will receive important diplomatic posts in Europe, and there they will support Mazzini and his gang. Mazzini's American contacts are either proto-Confederates or strict abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison. During the American Civil War, Mazzini will favor both the abolition of slavery and the destruction of the Union through secessionism, which is the London line. This subversion will be showcased during the famous tour of Kossuth in the United States, which will happen next year and the year after. Kossuth is going to be accompanied by Mazzini's moneybags, the Tuscan Freemason Adriano Lemmi. And on the eve of the Crimean War, with Palmerston doing everything to isolate Russia, Kossuth's line is that the tree of evil and despotism in Europe is, you guessed it, Russia. Kossuth will try to blame even the problems of Italy on Russia. Despite Kossuth's efforts, the United States will emerge as the only power friendly to Russia during the Crimean conflict. Kossuth will call for the United States to join with Russia, with England and France in a war against Russia, which is Lord Palmerston's dream scenario. Kossuth will even refuse to call for the abolition of slavery, and he'll get on very well with the slaveholders, since he's talking about a U.S. takeover of Cuba, which meshes perfectly with the secessionist program. So Mazzini is the zookeeper for all of these theme parks, but there are other zookeepers and still more theme parks in the human multicultural zoo. The custodians are Palmerston's other two stooges, David Urquhart and Napoleon III. Now there is also a theme park for the British lower orders. The keeper here is the strange and eccentric Scot, David Urquhart, the most aristocratic of Palmerston's stooges. Urquhart was chosen for his work directly by Jeremy Bentham, who praised our David in his letters. Urquhart took part in Lord Byron's Greek Revolution, but he found that he liked Turks better after all. He got a post in the British Empire in Constantinople and went native, becoming an Ottoman pasha in his lifestyle. His positive contribution to civilization was his popularization of the Turkish bath. But he also kept a harem much of the time. Urquhart was also of the opinion that late Ottoman feudalism was a model of what civilization ought to be. Urquhart became convinced that all evil in the world had a single root: Russia. The machinations of the court of St. Petersburg. That's a very convenient view for Lord Palmerston's Britain, which is always on the verge of war or at war with Russia. For Urquhart, the unification of Italy is a Russian plot. He once met Mazzini and concluded after 10 minutes that Mazzini is a Russian agent. That stooge on stooge violence again. Now this Russophobe thinks that the problems of Great Britain are only that Palmerston is a Russian agent and that Palmerston was recruited by one of his many, many mistresses, the Russian Countess Lieven. During the years of Chartist agitation, Urquhart bought up working-class leaders and drilled them in the litany that all the problems of the English working man come from Russia via Lord Palmerston. To these workers, Urquhart teaches something that he calls dialectics. Urquhart will be a member of Parliament and controls a weekly newspaper, the Free Press. Now, of course, Palmerston understands that his subversive methods will always generate opposition from the Tory gentry and the Colonel Blimp crowd and the straight-laced crowd. So he has taken the precaution of institutionalizing the opposition under his own control, with a raving megalomaniac leader to discredit it. Urquhart's demonization of Russia foreshadows something that will be called McCarthyism, about a century from now. Urquhart's remedy is to go back to the simplicity of character, and merry England, in the sense of retrogression to bucolic medieval myth. Quote, "The people of England were better clothed and fed when there was no commerce and when there were no factories." Unquote. That is vintage Urquhart. Now, does this talk of pre-capitalist economic formations strike a familiar chord? Does anybody smell a big, fat, commie rat? How interesting that Urquhart should be the controller of British agent Karl Marx, who earns his keep as a writer for Urquhart's paper. David Urquhart is the founder of modern communism. It is Urquhart who will prescribe the plan for Das Kapital. Marx is a professed admirer of Urquhart. He acknowledges Urquhart's influence more than that of any living person. Marx will even compose a life of Lord Palmerston based on Urquhart's wild obsession that old Pam is a Russian agent of influence. This says enough about Marx's acumen as a political analyst. Marx and Urquhart agree that there is no real absolute profit in capitalism and that technological progress causes a falling rate of profit. Another of Urquhart's operatives is a certain Lothar Bücher, confidant of the German labor leader Lassalle, later secretary to the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck himself. After Gettysburg, Urquhart will move to France and try to open a theme park for right-wing Catholics. He will try to meet Pius IX and will join Cardinal Newman's Oxford movement at the First Vatican Council in 1870. Our third stooge, the current president and soon-to-be Emperor of France, Napoleon III. Napoleon le Petit. As we have seen, he started off as a carbonaro and terrorist in contact with Mazzini. In 1836, Napoleon tried to parlay his famous name into a successful putsch. He failed and was exiled to America. Then Napoleon was given a private study at the new British Museum reading room and got to know Lord Palmerston. He began work on his book, Les Idées Napoléoniques. The main idea was that the original Napoleon was not wrong to be an imperialist, but only erred in trying to expand his empire at the expense of Great Britain. There's plenty of room for a French empire as a junior partner to the British. The preferred form of government would be democratic Caesarism with frequent plebiscites. Now, in 1848, Napoleon was working for the British as a special constable, a riot cop, to put down an expected Chartist revolution reported by Urquhart. There, Napoleon III, when he got to France, used his name to become president. Then he organized a coup d'etat to become emperor. Palmerston quickly endorsed the coup, but that caused hysteria on the part of the Victoria and Albert Palace clique. Palmerston was forced out, but he was soon back, stronger than ever. After hundreds of years of warfare, France at last had been broken, placed under a more or less dependable British puppet regime. The Western powers, the Anglo-French, were born. Napoleon III gave Palmerston one indispensable ingredient for his imperial strategy, a powerful land army. Soon an open Anglo-French entente was in full swing. When Victoria came to Paris, it was the first such visit by an English sovereign since Henry VI had been crowned King of France in Notre Dame in 1431. When Napoleon joined Palmerston in attacking Russia in the Crimea, it was the first war in 400 years to see France and England on the same side. Now, Napoleon III is Palmerston's strategic catamite, usually with about as much will of his own as an inflatable sex doll. We can think of him as a blow-up British agent. After the Crimea, Palmerston will need a land army against Austria and northern Italy. Napoleon, egged on by Cavour, who knows how to play the interstices, will oblige in 1859 with the great battle of Solferino. The same with Maximilian's Mexican adventure. During the American Civil War, Napoleon's pro-Confederate stance will be even more aggressive than Palmerston's own. In 1870, Bismarck will defeat Napoleon and send him back to exile in England. Here, Napoleon will plan a comeback, but he will figure that he has to be seen as a man on horseback. Problem is, he has a bladder ailment. The bladder operation designed to make him a man on horseback again will kill him. Napoleon III calls himself a socialist. He will style the latter phase of his regime the liberal empire. That means France as a theme park in the British Zoo. In 1860, Napoleon will sign a free trade treaty with the British. And on the way, he'll pick up a junior partner colonial empire in Senegal, and he will seize Indochina in 1862, something that will set the stage for a certain war in Vietnam about a century later. Under Napoleon, France will build the Suez Canal and lose it to the British. Napoleon III will furnish the prototype for the fascist dictators of the 20th century. After his defeat, he will bequeath to France a party of proto-fascist colonialists and revanchists beating the drum for Alsace-Lorraine, which Napoleon will lose. These revanchists will turn up in Vichy, the Fourth Republic, and the French Socialist Party of today. And so it will come to pass that Lord Palmerston will attempt to rule the world through the agency of a troika of stooges, each one of them the warden of some pavilion in a human zoo. The reason why must now be confronted. The British Empire exists in the mind of its victims. This is the empire of the senses, the empire of sense certainty, the empire of empiricism. It is the empire of British philosophical radicalism, of utilitarianism, of hedonistic calculus, existentialism, and pragmatism. Why are the British imperialists called the Venetian Party? Well, for one thing, they call themselves the Venetian Party. The future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, will write in his novel Coningsby that the Whig aristocrats of 1688 wanted to establish in England a high aristocratic republic on the model of Venice, making kings into doges with a Venetian constitution. During the years after the Council of Florence in 1439, the Venetian enemies of Nicholas of Cusa plotted to wage war on the Italian High Renaissance and Cusa's ecumenical project. To combat Cusa's Renaissance Platonism, the Venetians of the Rialto and Padova turned to a new-look Aristotelianism, featuring Aristotle's characteristic outlook, shorn of its medieval and Averroistic outgrowths. This was expressed in the work of Pomponazzi, Contarini. During the War of the League of Cambrai, an alliance of virtually every power in Europe threatened to wipe out the Venetian oligarchy. The Venetians knew that France or Spain could crush them like so many flies. The Venetians responded by launching the Protestant Reformation with three proto-stooges, or ur-stooges, Luther, Calvin, Henry VIII. At the same time, Contarini and his Jesuits made Aristotle a central component of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, and put Dante and Piccolomini on the index of prohibited books. The result was a century and a half of wars of religion, a little dark age culminating in the great crisis of the 17th century. Venice was a cancer, consciously planning its own metastasis. From their lagoon, the Venetians chose a swamp and an island facing the North Atlantic, Holland and the British Isles. Here, the Giovanni Party would relocate their family fortunes, their fondi, and their characteristic epistemology. France was colonized too, but the main bets were placed further north. First, Contarini's relative and neighbor Francesco Zorzi was sent to serve as a sex advisor to Henry VIII, whose raging libido would be the key to Venetian hopes. Zorzi brought much with him in his baggage. The Venetian party in England grew under the early Stuarts as Bacon and his wife, Thomas Hobbes, imported the neo-Aristotelianism of Fra Paolo Sarpi, the great Venetian game master of the early 1600s. Now, when James and Charles disappointed the Venetians in that 30 Years' War, Cromwell, Milton, and a menagerie of sectarians were brought to power in an all-Protestant civil war and commonwealth. This was the time of the Irish genocide, the foundation of the overseas empire in Jamaica. After the depravity of the Restoration, the glorious revolution of 1688 gave birth to the most perfect imitation of the Venetian oligarchical system that the world has ever seen. The great Whig and Tory aristocrats set as their goal a new, all-encompassing Roman Empire with its center in London. After the defeat of Leibniz's attempt to save England, Great Britain set off on the path of empire with a new Hanoverian Guelph dynasty. It was in the War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1713, This was the first war fought on a world scale and the last gasp for colonial rivals Spain and Holland. The Peace of Utrecht left the British supreme on the oceans. Louis XIV and Colbert were defeated by divide-and-conquer Venetian politics, and British cash was used to hire Brandenburg and Savoy to fight the French. By winning the coveted asiento, the monopoly on slave commerce with Spanish America, the British became the biggest slave drivers in the world. The wealth of Bristol and Liverpool would be built on slaves. After some decades of hellfire clubs, there came the War of the Austrian Succession, followed by the 7 Years' War. This was the end of France as a naval power and a worldwide rival for the British. William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, subsidized Frederick the Great of Prussia to win an empire on the plains of Germany. The British took Louisbourg, Quebec, drove the French out of Canada, became paramount in India. And at this point, like their successors in 1989, they were convinced that they could run wild, violating the laws of nature with no penalty, for nothing could now stand against them. But in loading their American colonies with their prohibitions of settlement and manufacture, their Quebec Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Act, Intolerable Acts, they set the stage for the American Revolution. In these years, William Petty, Earl of Shelburne and Marquis of Lansdowne, gathered a stable of ideologues and operatives, his stooges. These were Jeremy Bentham, Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, founders of British philosophical radicalism, the most primitive form of Aristotle ever devised. There also came a Siamese twin called free trade. Shelburne was defeated by Hamilton, Franklin, and Washington, but he did succeed in destroying and destabilizing much of France. By now, British policy was in the hands of Shelburne's student and protege, William Pitt the Younger. After letting the horrors of Bentham's agents brew up for 3 years, Pitt was able to unite the continental powers against France in the First, Second, and Third coalitions. Napoleon shattered these coalitions, but his final defeat was the work of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the Prussian reformers. But the beneficiaries were the British. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the British were clearly the dominant force, but still obliged to deal with Metternich, Russia, and Prussia. But under the regimes of Castlereagh and Canning, the stupidity, greed, and incompetence of Metternich and company made possible the revolutions of 1820, 1825, and 1830. By 1830, Lord Palmerston was ready to take control of the Foreign Office and begin his direct march to undisputed world domination. Metternich was still sitting on the lid of the boiling European cauldron, but Lord Palmerston and his three stooges were stoking the flames underneath. Now, there was a time when the center of oligarchy, usury, and geopolitics in the world was Venice, a group of islands in a lagoon at the top of the Adriatic. In the 16th century, in the wake of the League of Cambrai, Venice was that cancer, planning its own metastasis. These were the years during which a patrician party known as the Giovani, the youngsters, began meeting in a salon called Ridotto Morosini. It is here that the future course of England and Britain was charted.